Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Anglo Election Insights, where today, having made a video in September, just doing a bit of a sweep of the polling from across the Anglosphere, I've decided to come back again in October, and hopefully we can make this a monthly tradition. So without further ado, let's jump into the latest Australian federal polls. So we've got the 2025 result at the top. I would say we're seeing a few less outliers to the top end for the ALP on this occasion. A pretty big result in News Poll, YouGov as well, but some slight tightening, I guess you could say. I don't think it's really that meaningful at this stage, and obviously the coalition, if you could even call them that at this point, are still really struggling with navel gazing and their own internal issues, and now One Nation seem to be really capitalising on that, not only in the polls but also in terms of picking off a few of their MPs potentially. What strikes me here is that the Greens are not making any sort of gain, but at the same time they're not going backwards. But I do find it interesting that their support is just really stable. Labor's support is also very stable, so just a lot of changing of the deck chairs on the centre right, or a little bit further to the right perhaps. Basically you can see solid results here for the Labor Party, but we're not seeing so many of those outliers up towards like a 60% two-party preferred at the moment. There was this that just came out this evening as I record on Sunday evening. This is from 6 News, so I don't know a great deal about the methodology here, but this is basically based on these 5 polls, I think, including probably some like state level breakdowns and that kind of thing. So it's got the coalition gaining a seat, Labor losing 2 on net, the Greens losing their only seat in Ryan, One Nation winning their first seat in the House of Representatives. Apparently, that's the seat of Right, and Independents gaining 1, mostly because of winning a couple of seats off Labor. The key results here, you've got Labor winning Longman and also off the LNP winning Ryan off the Greens and winning Latrobe off the Liberals in Victoria. But at the same time, somehow the coalition are winning back. But like the Teal results, I'd be really interested to know the methodology, because they've got the Liberals winning back 2 Teal seats. So that's Bradfield and Kooyong. But at the same time, Labor is losing 2 seats, 2 Teals in Bean and Fremantle. It's pretty interesting. I'd love to know more about the methodology. You also have the CLP gaining Solomon, and the Nationals winning in Bendigo and Bullwinkle. I guess maybe if the Nats ran the same 2 candidates with a like similarly charged campaign, maybe that would be possible. But yeah, obviously they were 2 particularly strong candidates. But it's fun to see polls mapped out like this. But I would if any of you guys happen to know more about the methodology, please let me know. I'll do my own investigations, but this was interesting to see. And then finally, not much to add in terms of Australian state polling. Redbridge has polled Queensland again, but I couldn't find a top line figure. That might come out in the next day or so. But for the meantime, I've got their 56.5 lead to the coalition. Redbridge and Resolve printing pretty similar results in Victoria, and otherwise there's not really much more to add here. So for federal politics in Canada, the polls are tightening just a little bit more. Nanos actually had I think like a 40 to 39 or 39 to 38, something like that, a really tight poll. It's just widened slightly since then, a 2% lead to the Liberals, but they, between election cycles, they have been known to be a little bit friendlier to the Liberals from what I understand. So that's a pretty impressive result for the Conservatives, only a good few months after their federal election. The Tories leading by 1 in the latest Abacus poll and leading by 3 in the latest Angus Reid, with the NDP and the Bloc doing rather well at the expense of the Liberals. But in Ledger, the Liberals basically still well ahead on 6%. But I think in the last month it was more like 9 or 10. So tightening all across the board in federal Canadian politics in terms of their polls. Over in New Zealand, there's quite a fascinating situation developing. You may recall in last month's edition, the Labour or the Left Bloc had the lead or was tied in quite a few of these polls. Now, in terms of the primary vote battle, vote, between the two major parties, so National and Labour, Labour has more or less taken the lead in most of these polls, and actually quite a sizable lead, like 6% going off Talbot Mills here. But it's not necessarily translating to a lead in terms of the left bloc, as it sort of currently stands in New Zealand Parliament. So a lot of national vote share seems to be going to New Zealand First, which is somewhat reminiscent of what's happening on this side of the Tasman, where the coalition vote is splintering off to One Nation. And ACT is more or less keeping pace with where they were back in 2023, and the Greens and Te Pāti Māori aren't necessarily making big gains either. So in this latest round of polling, a couple of polls where Labour or the left bloc were level pegging, or maybe just slightly ahead, depending on like rounding. But in 3 of these polls, or in 2 of these polls, a reasonably sizable lead for the right bloc, mostly because of the surge in New Zealand First vote. So very interesting. Definitely be keeping an eye on that. New Zealand also had local elections. If any of you guys are in New Zealand and you know a little bit more about the wash up of that, do let me know. But I had a quick look and trying to work out the partisanship of some of the results wasn't easy to do on a quick glance. So if you happen to know a little bit more, do let me know. I heard that Labour were relatively happy with how the night went, so that's all I've really got to go off. I'd appreciate any tips on that local election result. So we'll jump over to the UK at the Westminster level. So here again, we've got the 2024 election, and then the numbers from the last week or so, just telling a completely different story. So Reform leading by either high single digits or low double digits across the board. Find Out Now being the most stark poll. Reform leading by 15%, and the Tories actually in second place on 17, with Labour and the Greens level pegging on 15. That's a dramatic result. YouGov seems to be a little bit more consistent and probably a little bit more realistic, I would say. I doubt, Reform could well be hitting or nudging 30% of the vote, but I doubt that the Tories are beating Labour on vote share. I find that difficult to believe. But you can see across the board, like Labour barely hanging into the 20s on vote share, and Reform, as I said, starting to push into the 30s. And when you look into the by-election results, we'll go through in a bit more detail later, but some of these seats, Reform was winning on, sort of early, mid 30% of the vote. Now they're starting to rack up like 40% in some of these more recent by-election results. But yeah, pretty damning stuff for the current Labour government in the current polls. And looking ahead into the next 6 months or so, you do have the next round of local elections coming up in May of next year. And if things don't improve for Labour by then, this time a lot more of their wards are up for election. And while last year the Tories bled seats to both the Lib Dems and Reform. This time, as I said, Labor has a lot of seats up, so it could be a real bloodbath if this trend continues. Also in May of next year, we have the Scottish and Welsh Parliament elections. Now, for the Scottish Parliament, I'm showing here the regional vote. There is also a constituency vote. So I thought the regional vote would be good just to show the relative support for each party generically. If you guys are in the UK, or particularly if you're in Scotland and you think that I should be going off the constituency vote, then please let me know, and then I'll just update that for next month. But it just seemed to me that the regional vote made more sense, but just let me know if that's a silly way of doing it. We can see here in the last election, the SNP did quite well, comfortably winning with 40% of the vote. Now, there's been a big falling away of their vote, quite a difficult 5 years of government that they seem to be in the middle of. The party has faced quite a lot of scandals and changes of leadership and that sort of thing. Yet they're still leading in the polls because at the same time, Labor has failed to make any inroads into in terms of their vote share, mostly because of their struggles at the Westminster level. The Tories also falling away completely from 23% of the vote down into the low teens. The Lib Dems have improved markedly according to these polls, and that would make sense to me. The Greens also, depending on the pollster, doing quite well in some of these polls. And then, of course, Reform. The Reform brand not travelling quite so well in Scotland. We did see in the Hamilton by-election, Reform running third behind both Labor and the SNP, and it looks like they've probably got a ceiling of about 20% of the vote. Just not an area where that sort of right-wing populism has a strong pull, but they probably are in the running for some of the constituencies and will certainly pick up seats. And then over in the Senedd, so this is the Welsh Parliament, I think since the devolution in like the late 90s, I think, Labor has basically governed Wales, but they have suffered this catastrophic collapse in support from 36% of the vote to basically the mid-teens, and there aren't a great deal of Senedd polls coming out. So some of these polls, like there were more, but I didn't include them all because they're getting quite old and quite dated. So this YouGov one is the latest one, which has Plaid Cymru just ahead of Reform by 1%. Couple of slightly older polls that had Labor doing a little bit better, probably mostly at Plaid's expense, and thus Reform were benefiting from some vote splitting on the left. But it seems now that there's a bit more of a firming of Plaid Cymru's vote on the centre-left. They're doing quite well with younger voters, and it appears that it's going to be more or less a two-horse race between Reform and Plaid Cymru. And you can see at these polls here that I've dragged from Wikipedia, this is Westminster voting intention. So it'd be interesting to see if a similar thing plays out and more of Labour's vote continues to bleed to Plaid Cymru. We can see the same thing as in Scotland, where the Tories have just completely fallen away from being sort of the major kind of opposition party to just completely down in the doldrums. And so again, we've got these council by-elections. So they happen every week. There's usually, like half a dozen council by-elections. And it's a nice way to sort of track where party support is trending. Some of these by-elections are actually getting reasonable turnout now. I think when I started paying attention to them at the start of this year, like they would get like maybe 10, 20% turnout. But now we're getting kind of like 30, even close to 40% turnout in some of these by-elections, which isn't bad for local election by-elections. So this, going back over the last month, you can see a lot of red and dark blue seats turning teal for Reform. But at the same time, when the Lib Dems and the Greens making some handy gains as well. And I will jump out of the slides just for the moment, and we'll have a look at the ones from this week, where a lot of the seats that were up were in the south, this area of the UK, or of England specifically, that is trending away from the Tories and towards the Lib Dems. There was a surprise pickup for Reform in a seat that the Lib Dems were defending, which it's quite rare for their vote to drop, 27%. Usually it's the other way. But Reform able to pick that one up with some vote splitting between the Greens and the Lib Dems. But elsewhere, the Lib Dems made major gains here at the expense of Labour, also the Tories. They managed to pick a seat off the Greens. But we can see here, like in Surrey, this is becoming Lib Dem heartland now, winning nearly a majority of the votes. A lot of these seats, Reform contesting for the first time, and they are becoming the second place party in some of these seats, but just like really precipitous drops in the Conservative vote across the board here. And this one in Scotland as well was interesting. The Independent managed to gain with a quarter of the vote, but we can see here the SNP, Labour and Reform all jostling for second place, which could be a bit of an indicator of how things might end up going in the Scottish Parliament elections. Speaking of those, the betting odds currently heavily favouring the SNP, with them leading the polls. But then in the Welsh Parliament, in the Senedd, you've got Reform actually the favourite to win the most seats. Not necessarily to form government, but Plaid Cymru second, and then Labour and the rest a distant third. But if you have a look at the potential makeup of the Senedd, which we can go here on Election Maps UK, they're now cast with the new electoral system that Wales is adopting, this kind of more like sort of proportional representation type model that they're using, sort of not unlike Victoria's upper house, if you're familiar. You can see Reform projected to win the most seats, but you would imagine between Plaid Cymru and Labour that they would probably form government in some sort of coalition. I can't imagine many of these parties would really want to work with Reform. And you can see here that between them they do have a majority of seats, whereas Reform and potentially the Tories, who I know they don't really want to work with, they wouldn't have the numbers. And you can see here that just while Reform definitely has the advantage in some of these areas, just to the north of Cardiff, it's really in some of these regional parts of Wales where Plaid Cymru is just running up the numbers, attracting nearly 50% of the vote in some of these areas. So it'll be an interesting battle to see who wins the most seats, but ultimately it is looking like Plaid and Labour will probably share government, but it's going to be a big loss of seats for Labour and a big gain for both Plaid and Reform. So we'll just jump back into the slides. No, not from there. We'll go from there. Just briefly to finish off. Some upcoming elections. So we have one coming up this week, actually, on Thursday UK time. So if you're following here in Australia, the results will probably come out like about lunchtime on Friday, depending on which state you're in. This is for Caerphilly, which is a small city to the north of Cardiff. Now, because Wales is changing over the way they conduct their elections from like a constituency-based election to a proportional, this is going to be like the last by-election of this nature until they change the electoral system, I guess. But for now, this is looking like a two-horse race between Reform and Plaid. There was a Survation poll conducted in this seat, and you can see Reform just inching ahead of Plaid Cymru, and Labour diving from, I think last time they got something like 46% of the vote. So this is like a Labour heartland seat, and now barely a quarter of their voters are sticking with them, and a lot of their support seems to have galvanised behind Plaid Cymru. But then, in these sort of former mining towns, Reform gaining a lot of support. Also, these are coming up quite quickly, these 2025 elections in the US. So we've got the Virginia, New Jersey gubernatorial races, the New York City mayoral race, which with Zoran Mandami quite comfortably the favourite, and also California voting on Proposition 50. So this is that whole like redistricting thing. So they'll be on November 4th, and I'll probably cover those at some point, maybe late next week, or probably next week. Do a quick preview of them. Of course, UK by-elections, they happen each week. There's usually at least 4, sometimes 7 or more. They happen on Thursdays. So again, if you're on the east coast of Australia like me, you'll see them come through the results on Friday. And then also, thanks to the commenter who alerted me to the Yukon Territory election. So if you have a look at the polling, the Liberal government is currently polling well behind the centre-right Yukon Party, with the NDP actually coming second in a lot of these polls. And what's interesting is that there's also like a plebiscite on electoral reform for ranked choice voting. And I can imagine why the Liberals and the NDP would be quite keen for that, because as you can see, they're essentially just completely splitting the left vote, which is allowing Yukon to dominate the polling from a first past the post perspective. So it'd be interesting to see how voters react to that. I think the Yukon Party wants to take it to a referendum. And you can see here, it's like it's going to be quite funny to watch. I covered the Newfoundland and Labrador election, which, I thought that was a pretty small election. Here we've got like barely 20, we're expecting probably like barely 20,000 votes. And, so each seat is going to have like just over 1,000 electors. So, it's going to be a pretty small election, but I'll be interested to see the results. I'll once we see the results come through, I'll make a quick video on that, no doubt. But that brings us to the end of my October polling sweep. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I didn't really cover the US much this time. If we get some, perhaps every couple of months I'll come back and just check in with the polling. But what I have noticed is the congressional ballot is getting a little bit tighter. The Republicans are gaining some ground and seemingly doing a bit better out of this shutdown situation, but a lot of the focus is on the gubernatorial races. And if you do want to check out my thoughts on those races, I did do a little collaboration with Election Times News, which I'll include a link to in the description. We chatted on those elections and also 2026 Senate races for a good hour, I think it was in the end. So that one's there if you are interested. But thanks, guys. Thanks for watching through to the end if you're still here. Remember, if you're enjoying the content and you're new, please subscribe to the channel. I upload pretty regularly. And also, my birthday's coming up next weekend, and I've got a pretty busy week. So I've put 4 videos out over the last week, so there's plenty of content to catch up on. I probably don't expect much from me just for the next week or so. But thank you very much, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.